Leave me alone! Ah!
Akira!
I can't really say that I'm quite the connoisseur of this kind of medium, but it's also not like I literally know nothing about it either. Even if I'm not some hardcore fan, I find it interesting to see some of the discussions from stuff I am absolutely unfamiliar with. Sometimes it's just fun to see people get really heated over what is essentially nothing, but it's just about as interesting to see why someone would want to spend months of their life to talk about a sports anime with the sole intent of making you be as big of a fan of it as they are. In some of these talks, you can find genuine passion in what they are saying, and even if what they are saying isn't my kind of thing, I choose that every single time over another grifter that thinks that calling your opposition a tourist is some thought-provoking criticism. Going back to anime though, the big talk you might see nowadays is in relation to the quality of the show you watch, since this year in particular has left a lot of people repeatedly disappointed with the show they got. Something like One Punch Man Season 3 is certainly going to get a lot of people talking about the working conditions of your average animator. At least I hope it does, because the natural conclusion of you not caring will always result in less animators and more middle management to optimize workplace abuse. But I'm not quite as interested in that kind of issue as much as the older and more divisive debate over localization. People really like to get too into the discussion over creator intent, among other focus points here, but I never get the idea that people actually know what a localizer does. Obviously, the end goal of that occupation is to get the original work to the language you are native to, but that doesn't actually explain how they go about doing that. It's a shame too, because it's really interesting to see all the creative ways these workers go about navigating some of the hardest aspects of these works, only for some of that effort to be left unappreciated by the greater fan base of this medium. While I am mostly just going to be talking about anime's role towards localization here, this discussion is not exclusive to just anime. I'm just choosing to do it this way because, as simple as people like me tend to make all of this seem, you'll find that this conversation is extremely nuanced. I wouldn't doubt that if I widened this discussion out to include more than just the one topic, you could find a contradiction. And that's just simply due to how there's different tools to do the same job but in different contexts. It should go without saying, but translation and localization are two very different methods that aim to make it easier for you to understand something from a foreign culture. They are both useful in this field, but for our main use case, localization makes the best sense because we aren't focusing so much on what the words that were literally said in these shows or books, but more about what these words are supposed to mean and how drastically a sentence could feel when you move a couple words around. Regardless, localization's importance is probably more relevant nowadays than what used to be the discussion 10 or so years ago when it was mostly just fan dubbing. Because at the very least back then, if the show you were watching had a bad localization, you still had other licensees, if not people with a lot of time in their hands, that probably had the proper resources to do a full localization, or at the very least cared about the source material. But with streaming services like Crunchyroll, Netflix, Hulu, or Amazon Prime, on top of the fact that there's a comical amount of exclusivity that can make being a fan an expensive hobby, the version that service releases is more or less the only way to watch that show you want to see. And if they fuck it up, you can't just watch a different version. You either have to watch it as is, or learn the language it came from. This is why I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking about the failures of localization, because I know that a practice like this is very open to abuse and has a long history of catastrophic failures, and that abuse is what keeps bringing us back to this war we have on localization. It's all just a reaction to when that trust we put into the unsung heroes of the industry is broken, and it's not easy to fix something as fragile as trust. A lot of the negative reputation this field gets is almost entirely due to how Funimation handled a couple of shows nearly a decade ago, and then they acted like assholes about it when people started criticizing them. So now people just think that localizers don't respect the medium when that's not even close to true. There's tons of people out in this field that work for this industry and accept everything about it, warts and all, simply because they love the medium too much to consider those faults a deal breaker. It's just not fair to point fingers at the workers just so we can save face for some billion-dollar company that wants to skim on expenses. I still want to be very clear that there still are bad localizations out there that I haven't covered, and this video isn't really meant to put down those that rightfully call that stuff out. But I'm also not just gonna allow a dogpile either. If your immediate reaction to seeing your TV show suck is to start lashing out at the employees or the people saying they liked it, you're just about as part of the problem, and maybe you should seek other forms of entertainment if a soundbite or some out-of-context clip is enough to make you lose your shit. If you are capable of holding said shit, we can start talking about this interesting field by looking at how we started talking about the importance of localization. There are two important names that contextualize the greater issue most localizers will have to deal with every single time they work on something, which is that when you are localizing localizing something that came from another culture, how do you balance your approach that satisfies both a target culture and a source culture? The former culture is the outsider audience that the localizer designs a work to appeal to, while the latter is the original culture the work was created from that the localizers refer to. And as we're about to see, it's not as simple as just focusing all in on one or the other. If you put too much on target culture, then your audience will start to notice that the product is not being authentic to its source material. You put too much on source though, and it becomes too hard for your audience to follow since you either did a bad job carrying over the tone, or a lot of cultural context that was required to understand what was going on got lost in translation. This was mostly a topic that arose from when Italy in the 1970s among Spain and France started to become a powerhouse of anime distribution. These countries absolutely adored the medium, but the broadcast networks always had a nasty habit of tampering with the works a little more than they should have. You had your name changes, there were a lot of times where a show would remove the culture being portrayed in the original work, and there definitely was a lot of local culture being injected into the content as well. And when most of the country is not familiar with a foreign language, nor do they have a point of reference for the original work, the discussion of a proper localization wasn't really a big topic because, unsurprisingly, people who don't know much about the source material aren't going to call a localizer out when they screw that work up. It wasn't until more source culture-oriented works started coming out that would open the discussion up, as more popular works in Italy would go on to get a proper localization with some publishers like Yamato Video, who would redub the entire work for the home release and provided both versions for people to watch as a way to compare between the two. And that, for the most part, was a lot of people's first introduction to this debate over target culture versus source culture, at least in this specific context. Of course, it's still easier said than done to accomplish this, because languages don't behave like a cipher where once you decode it, it contains the complete message every time. It's always an approximation of what the message says, and it's up to the people that interpret it to catch on to slang or other word oddities that can come up. My favorite example of this is the sequel to Yume Nikki, where in Japanese it is called Yume Nikki. These are very different words from one another simply by making the second word a portmanteau of two in diary by taking advantage of the fact that ni means two. And I think it's pretty neat how they were able to do that, but there is no real easy way to replicate this kind of pun in English. So the localization team did the next best thing and just put a 2 in the title. Localizers back then also kind of knew that this was an issue as well, especially the localization team at Disney when the studio got the licensing rights to Studio Ghibli as a home release. Their first movie, Kiki's Delivery Service, was a very rough start for their relationship, as the studio seemed to not have any confidence that the product as is would be good enough for the viewer, so they added their own flair, such as the music being replaced with Sydney Forrest, and the film had a very nasty tendency to add lines that weren't in the original, specifically to add noise to scenes that otherwise were intentionally quiet. And it certainly wasn't their last time having issues, especially in 1999 when Harvey Weinstein was directing the dub for Princess Mononoke, and the conflict between the two studios got so bad that Toshiya Suzuki famously mailed a sword to him with a simple message. By 2001, Disney's executives were practically looking to pull the plug on the license, but Pixar's John Lasseter took over as the executive producer for Spirited Away after he saw the original and absolutely adored the film. You could say it was an uphill battle for Lasseter and Kirk Wise, who was also recruited off of his work for the co-director for Beauty and the Beast. This mostly was due to how Disney was actively screwing with the success this film could have had because they just didn't want to spend any money promoting it, and it definitely hurt in sales as a result. I mean, it still made $10 million, but that was only after enough word of mouth got people interested. Even though it may not be a financial success in Disney's eyes and barely anybody saw it at that time, it only just needed to be seen by the right people at the right time to realize just how important this work is, which allowed it to be the second ever winner for the Academy Award for Best Animated Film. This dub might very well be one of the most shining examples of how to do a localization correctly, which is why some people like Mariko Hanada from the University of Rome made a study case on how Lasseter's team accomplished this. They brought up 3 main strategies that were found throughout not just the English version of Spirited Away, but also the Italian dub as well, just to see how these techniques affect the reception between both cultures so that it's something everybody gets to enjoy regardless of country. The 3 strategies that were listed were transference, the unconscious redirection of a feeling, attitude, or desire from one person to another, functional equivalence, when something serves the same function as another to offer optional ways to convey the proper message, and paraphrasing, which is useful when a general word or something that can be borrowed to use the other 2 methods are seemingly impossible. These tools allow the translation to convey the same points as close to the source material for the sake of authenticity, and seem to, for the most part, be very excellent guidelines to ensure an ethical process is done every time. Now, a really big gripe I've seen from a lot of localization discussions is usually about how they tend to insert pop culture references or mannerisms that shouldn't really be a thing considering the setting, i.e. they're modernizing the script. But I've also noticed that when this discussion gets brought up, you'll find that these people tend to be pretty selective of what is and isn't okay. That's not intended to be a jab at every critic that does this, because they should be aware that there's a tolerable level of adaptation. But what I am saying is that the line they use to draw that distinction is not fairly applied to every single work they review. It's certainly not a coincidence that when people talk about Prison School's infamous arcade scene, they're not specifically raising hell over the Happy Days reference.
Are you one of those dumbass gamer?
I've always found it to be silly to treat the attempt of adapting a work for a more modern audience as a negative thing, because that could describe the thought process behind almost every single anime that has ever been localized in the first place. If it's not obvious why people think this way, it's because the target culture for a lot of the examples people use to compare the modern audience with the Golden Age were modern adaptations that aren't modern anymore, since these shows are pushing 30 by the time we start talking about them. A lot of people's favorite shows are very likely to have originated from the Toonami block that aired on Adult Swim, which was mostly the responsibility of Funimation to localize, and that team frequently changed a lot of the shows to help them stand out. Yu Yu Hakusho was changed to be a lot more edgy by adding a lot more swearing and aggression to the dialogue, which was not present in the original. G Gundam's Ocean dub doubled down on being a wackier interpretation of the original, which you would think would make people hate it more, but it ends up becoming one of their favorite shows because of it. And who could ever forget the Home for Infinite Losers? If the issue is simply that localizers were changing a script to appeal to a modern audience, shouldn't we be a lot harsher to the shows we hoist up as paragons of the industry? You should already know the answer to that, because like I said, there's a tolerable level. But where do you draw that line? I don't know, because there's just way too much stuff over the past 50 years that we could cover, and I'm not going to pretend to act like I'm supposed to know everything about this kind of medium. But if we're talking about adaptations, the most common complaint you might see when something is adapted is when they censor it, and that happens to be something I've talked about before, so at the very least I can give you something to think about here. Censorship tends to be the most unfortunate part of localization, since we all kind of know that this is a bad practice to do, and despite knowing this, almost every work is going to be subject to it because opting out usually means you don't get published overseas. I feel like a much more noticeable difference from how the United States handled anime compared to Italy was that America was in a cultural shift that drastically narrowed down the identity of mainstream media. Since the industry goes where the money is, they changed the games, movies, and shows to appeal to that kind of stuff, and what couldn't be adapted got downplayed the fuck out of. There wasn't really any room for exposing a new culture to the audience, and if you add that with the unrestricted internet forum culture at the time, you can kinda see how that when some people interacted with the raw, unedited culture, they tend to get really fucking racist about it.
My question is, could you tell me what kind of about recently Japanese? What do you think about recently Japanese game?
Is it what is about Japanese games that inspired us?
Recent.
Most recent Japanese
I'm sorry.
games.
They suck. I'm sorry. Like, you guys need to get with the times and make better interfaces and like update your technology. We're totally kicking your ass. Back then, you guys were the king of the world, but your time has passed. I'm so sorry.
Did you look at his face? Look at what you did, Phil.
That stigma of Japanese media back then never really went away either, such as how JRPG as a title stuck despite several Japanese developers openly expressing their hatred for the label, or how it's a cliche at this point to talk about how Japan as a country is extremely liberal about how it portrays sex, the latter especially being a technique to demonize the country and encourage further censorship, for the sake of preventing perversion in the United States. Timing also couldn't be any worse for this medium considering how the country was still shaken by the satanic panic, so the companies that were responsible for localization were pretty strict about what gets broadcasted on the face of it, but that's only a surface level look, and not really looking at how localizers weren't really given much agency to maintain the source culture we want, and also keeping the TV networks happy. The publishers are only interested in making money, and you can't do that when you're consistently being slammed by moral controversies if you showed all these products as is. A couple shows compromise by reducing the amount of offending material to get it past, sometimes a little too much, One Piece is probably the biggest victim of all this because 4Kids wanted to acquire the license only because they saw how well it was doing in Japan. And without even looking at what was in the show, they bought the rights to air it on their network, only to then find out after they were knee-deep in the localization process that the show was frequently violent and used drugs and had a lot of other taboos that would get the network in trouble. Because of the rules set by American Kids Networking, they out of necessity had to censor a lot of the show. So I can't even really be that upset at the people who had to censor this stuff since that was kind of their job. Doing a bad localization has been proven several times to be harmful to the reception this stuff gets, so it makes sense why people are so anal about this kind of thing. But I also don't agree with the idea that the end-all solution is to just literally translate one-to-one what is on the screen. At the same time though, this is only just an objective position on the matter, so if someone wants to still watch the original interpretation, that's a completely valid decision. Like, there's a reason why if you want to go to the movies to watch that new Chainsaw Man movie, you get to choose between the sub and dub. Having more options to enjoy the thing you want to watch is always a welcome function for this field. At the same time though, we also have to consider that even the dubs are not literal translations. They just look like they are because these lines tend to get handled by a different team that need to make those lines work for lip syncing once it reaches the dub. This is why it's just as important to consider the importance of subtitle work as much as dubbing. Especially at a time when companies think people won't notice when they skim on the sub, which of course leads into the debate over the use of AI in the workforce. I've seen some discourse over how some people feel about these tools being used, but it's hard to take them seriously a bit because they seem to only be in support of AI specifically because they want to fuck over the workers, rather than because they actually like the end result. I still take a position against the use of AI in the workforce for many reasons, but the simplest answer is that this tool only really helps prompt engineers that weren't able to translate something in the first place. Localizers don't need to use that shit, and if they really need a means to streamline the process, they already have CAT and TMS. The former software is great for streamlining the entire translation process by aiding the translator for the harder aspects of the process, rather than the software doing all the work for them. It's kind of like how some tools in VS Code or some IDEs use IntelliSense and other handy tools like autofill, so you don't have to literally remember every single function in a class or every single potential property of an object you want to look at or edit. If the computer suggests an autofill option, you have the full ability to ignore the tool as well if you know what you're doing. When you work with this kind of software, you are always in control of what the output is going to be. On the other hand, TMS is a more hands-off approach to localization by choosing to automate all the tedious aspects of the localization process so that you can pool more resources into the harder stuff that needs that kind of time to work on. Since this is also a content management system by design, it's also a really good tool when you need to build the workflow that is going to be used by a lot of people that are handling this project at the same time, along with the ability to receive feedback and comments on each ticket. Both of these softwares together can make for an efficient process that many translators and localizers love and adore to use. But what also makes them so good is that you don't need them to do your job either. ML tools are almost entirely reliant on the software you use, and while some of them may be free right now, that's not a guarantee, especially when most of these tools are being subsidized by the government among a bubble of companies funding themselves to operate this stuff. When that funding stops, they aren't going to make these tools free anymore, and they are really going to beef the prices up for enterprise solutions that rely too much on this technology to back out of it. The one use case that is even really justifiable for ML software would have to be for translating rather than localization, and that's perfectly fine for your average dipshit who spent $60 on a book without checking what is actually in it. Although even that still tends to have its restrictions, because there's no way someone's going to have the patience to read a book exclusively with Google Lens. I tried, and it's an awful experience. Of course, this is all just only focusing on the technical aspect for why none of this can work, but you're more likely to see people focusing on how AI is creatively bankrupt. And it's not that hard to look for examples either nowadays. A lot of Amazon Prime fans got to experience why AI shouldn't be used to localize firsthand after people found out very quickly that Banana Fish, a shoujo series dating back in 1985 to 1994, that people were more than excited to watch, was using AI to localize the English and Spanish dub, not the subtitles, the dub.
You overgrown son of a bitch! Hurry! This way!
Don't let
Come
him
on!
escape! Skipper! No, please! No, Skipper!
I can't believe you committed suicide. I cannot believe you committed suicide. How could you have done this? How could you have committed suicide?
It didn't take too long for Amazon to take the dub down after people rightfully called it out, but that was only one case. The company is still trying to push this technology onto the consumer whether they like it or not, such as how they added an AI dub for Vinland Saga along with No Game No Life. And as of me writing this, they still haven't taken out the Spanish dub for Banana Fish. The Japan Association of Translators have already been pretty vocal about their take on AI for the medium, as they did write a position paper on the mass translation of manga using AI being exported overseas, expressing their concerns that relying on an unreliable resource like this is actively harmful to the industry. It mainly addressed three things: that AI is not able to reflect the nuances of the medium, which kills the value manga has; the reliance on AI takes jobs from skilled translators, among the cheap disposal of human resources for cost reduction; and poor quality translations will only increase the spread of black market alternatives that get the proper localization, and raise distrust among manga retailers since they failed to provide the content people wanted. The thing about this whole topic is that generative AI tools have been known to be a disruptive utility, and using AI to translate work is no exception, especially if the cost is exponentially lower than hiring a translator to do the job. It's not as simple anymore as just telling people to not use AI anymore. We're a little bit past that point now where it's just being shoved into wherever you can put it, regardless of if it actually helps you produce work better. For the case of localization, I can only see it being useful for a quick translation that the translator could have already handled on their own anyway. Beyond that, there should be no good reason why something devoid of humankind is being implemented in an anthropologically dependent practice like this, other than to scam your audience out of a human experience. Or because you just don't want to pay your localizers. As much as I would like to talk about how valuable bilinguals seem in the workforce, and as a result they get paid pretty well to speak multiple languages, neither of these aspects are really a given when you talk about anime production. Going back to Crunchyroll, they don't actually pay translators a salary and instead opt in for freelance work. One mantra you'll typically see since 2020 being that you'll only get paid $80 an episode. You also don't get to pick your hours either, since a lot of shows operate on simulcast, which is when the shows end up on streaming shortly after it airs in Japan. So some work is going to be on a very tight and unfavorable schedule. Something that needs to be done by 7 p.m. in Japan will need you to be working on it as early as 3 a.m. in the US. And if you think of going to those third-party jobs like Netflix anime, you'd be lucky to really make a livable income, let alone be hired in the first place as fresh talent. Your NDA makes it difficult to talk about your wages, your work, and sometimes the studio just doesn't credit you anyway. So it makes it both hard to understand the true value of a translator in this field, and it's especially hard to show off any portfolio work, so you're more likely than not stuck working for the guys that are shacking your paycheck for years with no option to go somewhere else. The practice is generally undercut in wages, partially because back then the people writing English subs literally didn't get paid for it, and they just wanted people to see their favorite shows. But Studio Trigger and David Productions aren't going to willingly ignore the millions of dollars that they can make if they localize Delicious in Dungeon and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure just because they don't want to pay for a localizer. So why do we still pay our translators like these studios don't have any intention of localizing their work? If you're looking at a localization discussion, you've probably seen the Kanipa Effect's take on the industry, and he brought up a pretty good theory on why things are the way they are today is because of this guy, Ken Hoinski. I recommend you check out the video because it goes a lot more into detail on this discussion, but to summarize, he was the guy that made what is today's Department for Translation for Crunchyroll, formerly called MX Media LLC, and his firm ruled the market since he paid pennies to the dollar for work compared to the competitors needing to pay hundreds more, partially because a lot of the people working for him were mostly fandubbers that would have worked for free anyway. That's not entirely what a lot of people know him for though. They know him for his book he made about seducing women shortly after he left the industry, a book that resulted in him having to run away to Japan and change his name in embarrassment because the mainstream media raked him under the coals, since a lot of his advice was essentially just telling you to commit rape. It's been more than a decade, and through years of this creep's lowball pricing influencing other competitors to follow suit, there's just now an entire industry that is being undercut and thinking it's okay because as far as most late 2010s translators are concerned nowadays, this has always been the standard. As grim as this might sound, at the very least there's been a lot more awareness towards the working conditions in the past few years, and while that isn't going to amount to much, it at least might help those trying to get into the field to understand their worth as a translator. The anime industry sure as hell isn't going to help your career, but you don't have to translate anime to get your foot in the door, let alone pay your bills. There's no real requirement to translate, and in the worst case you'll only really be asked to take the Japanese language proficiency test and score somewhere close to an N2. But realistically, as long as you can prove that you are eager to get work done, you can find a job as a translator if you know where to look for one, and those places won't fuck you over when you need to look for other employment. That said, I can understand if you just want to get in because you're excited to work for the anime industry, fully aware that it's not profitable and just like the medium, and that's great if you want to do that. But if you do get the chance to advocate for those that aren't in such a position to work that way, you should absolutely do that. You need to make it very clear to the industry that you're either going to be getting cheap labor or getting good localizations, but you can't have them both. And the viewer doesn't really have a lot of things they can do because it's not as simple as just boycotting Funimation. There have been some initiatives as of late where Japanese legislation protects freelance work while adding union power to those in the industry. The promotion of IAC helped younger workers get into the industry easier, and one notable achievement being that there's now going to be an organization that oversees the industry to maintain a fair standard. mattered. This was all done in response to a labor shortage directly affected by the horrible working conditions animators and just the industry in general was receiving that directly affected the bottom line. But that's all happening in Japan. The workers out of country aren't going to get the same treatment. So if there's going to be an initiative to improve localization, it's going to probably have to happen in your country with your labor unions, with your advocacy groups. But most importantly, it's also just as important for you to learn about your own country's relationship with localization if you aren't in America. If you are able to make sure that the localization teams are treated well, they will take great care of your favorite works.